Okay, thank you. Good morning, all of you. Before I start the class, let me tell you one or two points here. Uh, we have put the teaching schedule for this month on our website. You can access the website there, and under the academics in the teaching schedule, department wise, we have put the schedules for this month. So please go through it, and whenever you come to attend the class, you just read the topic once and come prepared so that it becomes easy for you to understand. And once you have a little idea of what we are going to teach, we can build up on the clinical related aspects for that particular topic. This is one point which I wanted to say. The second thing is regarding the request for starting offline classes. We have received very clear instructions from KNR even in a couple of days back that students are to be called to the campus only for conducting or taking practicals, and that too for the examination going batch. So your seniors, the immediate senior batch who are in anatomy physiology and who are appearing for the exams, they are coming here. And subsequent your super seniors and the seniors to them, they are coming to the campus only to attend the practicals. Till then, the KNR in his intimation and his note has said that the online classes to be continued. Whether the third point here is whether the pandemic there or it's over or they bring things come back to normal. The NMC in its 9th schedule has clearly stated that the online classes needs to be continued depending upon the college preference. So if you just go to the NMC site and you see the curriculum, course curriculum, open the 9th schedule or the 9th topic, there you will see online teaching module. So in this module, they have given us clear-cut guidelines how often it has to be conducted and how the online classes have to be conducted. And lastly, I find that there was a good response to the interactive session, the doubt clearing session which we had on Saturday. Many of you have expressed their doubts about various topics and we had made a list of it. Some of them could be clarified, some of them could not be clarified. Those which could not be clarified, there are the topics which we need to take it at the end in integrated physiology. So some requests were there for genetics, some topics on genetics. Genetics comes under integrated physiology, where integrated physiology is a chapter by itself. Under this, various topics have to be covered. We will cover the genetics in that particular session. Now coming back to our topic now, we have completed the first chapter, general physiology. All of you read it thoroughly because it is very important topic. It is the basis for developing the physiological aspects, for understanding the key concepts of physiology. And in general, you remember that if you have a good understanding of the physiology, the basics of physiology, it becomes for you easy to understand what is the normal functioning in the body or how normal functioning takes place. When you have a clear concept of what normal functioning is taking place and how it is happening and how the mechanisms are functioning in the normal maintenance of the systems of the body or the functioning of the body, any deviation from that or abnormal abnormal deviation or abnormal behavior you can understand very easily. What I mean to say that if you understand the normal functioning easily, the understanding the concept of the disease and the treatment of disease becomes very easy. So it is very much essential that you go through the topic then and there on that particular day and give a reading once or twice. One more advantage for you at this particular time, there is a saying that there is an opportunity in this adversity. So since these classes are going on online for you, you are having sufficient time at home to go back to the books, read the books, see some online videos on that particular topic and understand it well. Once you start coming offline, you will be busy from morning 9 to 4, or even if those who are day scholars coming from outside, 1.5 or 2 hours per day will go in traveling time. So you will get very less time to revise the topics. So just use this opportunity to get thorough in the topics which we are covering, because every day we have just 2 sessions. The rest of the some 8 or 9 hours is free from the official time point of view, plus whatever in extra time you can put. Please see to that you put some time and effort in your basic concepts. Now let us go on to the properties of nerve. Now in the last class there was a discussion on the nerve structure, the basic classification of nerves. You would have been told about the Erlanger's and Gessiner's classification of nerve. This classification is based on the diameter of the nerve and the velocity with which the impulse is conducted. Now let us see some of the properties which a nerve exhibits in the normal functioning. Now first, transmission of information. Now information must be transmitted within each neuron and between neurons. Now you know that a basic nerve structure consists of, let us say, a cell body, an axon, and a dendrites. Now the basic function of the neuron is that it generates certain signals which we call it as action potentials or an impulses. These impulses are generated at some particular point of the nerve. Maybe the impulse may begin in the cell body or the impulse may begin in the axon. Now this particular impulse may have to travel from one point to the entire length of the neuron, and it has to travel within the neuron in both the directions. Anterograde means forward conduction, retrograde means backward conduction. If usually the traveling of the impulse is from one end to the other end unidirectional, that is from the cell body towards the axon and towards the dendrites. This is regarding the transmission of impulse within a single nerve fiber or a single neuron. Now suppose if the impulse is generated in the cell body of the neuron, which is the beginning point of the neuron, impulses would travel from the cell body of the neuron towards the axon hillock and towards the axon towards the dendrites. But if some point, in some instance, if the impulse is generated at the point that is in the middle of the neuron, somewhere in the axon or in the axon hillock, then the impulse may travel towards one end, but it also needs to go back, so even bidirectional flow can occur within the neuron. But you also are aware that the neurons are not single entities. It's a chain of neurons where two neurons are connected with one another in the form of synapses. So it is also essential that this nerve impulse or this signal must be transmitted from one neuron to the other neurons, and that transmission occurs through the synapses. So what are synapses? Synapses are nothing but the junctions between where two neurons communicate with each other, or the neurons may communicate with the muscle structure or with the cellular structures. We know that ultimately one neuron, two neuron, that's why we have an entire length of the neuron, and that neuron may end on a muscle, that is another synapse. It may end on a cell. The cell may be a part of a gland, or it may end on another neuron. So all these synapses, all these junctions are called as synapses, and it is essential that transmission of impulses or transmission of information must travel from one neuron to another neuron. I'll give you one example. Say for example, when you are holding a pencil, the fact that you are holding a pencil or a pen with the tip of the fingers, the impulse or the sensory nerve is getting stimulated only at the tip of the finger. Or if you have a little pain or got hurt at the tip of the finger, the sensory nerves are getting stimulated there only. The stimulus is at the sensory nerve of the sensory neuron at the tip of the finger. But this impulse has to travel throughout the length of the sensory neuron, throughout the hand, reach the spinal cord, enter into the spinal cord, go to the higher center, relay this impulse or relay this information that there is a pain at the tip of the finger to the central nervous system, and the central nervous system will send back impulses either to remove the pain or make you aware that you are holding a pencil. So the point is, the neuron is stimulated in a particular small area at the tip of the fingers, but this impulse, this sensory impulse that your fingers are holding a pencil or touching some object, is transmitted all throughout the length of the nerve. So in this process of transmission of signals from the tip of the finger till the central nervous system, there is not a single neuron, but there will be first order neuron, two neurons, three neurons. So this information, though it is maybe the cell body there or the axon of that particular sensory nerve is getting stimulated, but this impulse or this sensory information is transmitted all along the nerve, then from the synapse, from one or first order neuron to the second order neuron to the third order neuron, then to the brain tissue, and the brain tissue then sends back impulses of whatever response it wants to. So this is one of the characteristic feature of a nerve, property of a nerve, that transmission of impulses or transmission of information has to take place within the neuron and from one neuron to the other neuron. Now, what are the other properties of nerve? The other properties are, first, excitability, conductivity, all or none law, refractory period, accommodation, summation, indefatigability, and adaptation. So, excitability, briefly we will go one by one a little later, but I'll just introduce the concept. Excitability is the ability of the nerve to respond to a stimulus. So that is called as excitability of the nerve. Some nerves may be highly excitable, some nerves may have less excitability. So this excitability is a property of a nerve. That is, the ability to respond to a stimulus is called as excitability. Now what is conductivity? Conductivity is, once the nerve responds to a stimulus, this impulse has to travel all throughout the length of the nerve. So that ability to transmit impulses from one point to the other point is called as conductivity. Third, all or none law. The word says that if the nerve stimulates, it stimulates all nerves, or it doesn't get stimulated at all. So if a nerve is stimulated, it will respond completely or it will not respond at all. Now, refractory period, it is a period where the nerve does not respond to any stimulus. Then accommodation, adaptation, summation, I will discuss in detail as we go through the subsequent slides. Indefatigability. Indefatigability means the fatigue. The word fatigability means getting fatigued. Indefatigability means the nerves cannot and does not undergo fatigue. They are indefatigable. Now let us see the first property, excitability. Now excitability, as I said, means the ability of the neuron or the nerve fiber to respond to a stimulus. Now, on what factors does the excitability depends on? Now the excitability depends upon the strength of the stimulus. What do you mean by strength of the stimulus? Stimulus means a change in the external environment. If you have remember the last class, I said that there are various types of stimuli. The stimuli can be a physical stimulus, a chemical stimulus, a mechanical stimulus, or a thermal stimulus. Now let us see what is the meaning of a strength of a stimulus with respect to giving an example of a mechanical stimulus. The strength of the stimulus here means suppose somebody is hitting you with a scale or hitting you with a stick. Now the force of the stick with which the power with which the person is hitting you on your hand with the stick is the strength of the stimulus. So if greater the strength of the stimulus, the greater will be the excitability of the nerve. Or if it is a general touch, it will be a little less excitable, whereas if you hit it with a more force, and that is the strength of the stimulus is more, the excitability will be more. Now duration of the stimulus. Duration of the stimulus is how long that external agent or that external stimulus is stimulating the nerve. Say for example, a very hot object, you touch that hot object to remove it. There the duration of the stimulus will be very less. But if you continue to keep your hand over that particular hot object, then the duration of the stimulus is prolonged. So excitability also depends upon the duration of the stimulus. The frequency, how many times are you giving that particular stimulus, is the meaning of frequency of stimulus. Direction of current, I just ignore that point, direction of current. The other factor is presence or absence of injury. Say for example, if a particular area of your skin is injured. Say for example, you are having a boil. Now, or you have got hurt in particular area of the body. Now, the area of the body where there is a boil, you will find that surrounding that particular area there is redness. Now, that particular area where there is redness, you will find that it is hyperexcitable area where a simple touch will elicit a pain. In the normal areas of the body, if you just keep your finger on the normal area of the body, you will not feel pain, you will just feel a touch. But in that particular area where you have got a boil or you have got an abscess, even when you touch, you will not realize the touch sensation, but you will feel the pain. So presence of injury may make the nerve more excitable. So excitability depends upon the injury, the nature of the injury. Or if there is a complete damage to the nerve or the nerve supply itself is cut, then because of the damage to the nerve, complete resection of the nerve or complete cutting of the nerve fibers, there may be no excitability at all. The other is the effect of external or internal agents. The meaning of the effect of external or internal agent means the excitability of the nerve also depends upon certain internal agents. Like internal agents, the concentration of calcium ions, the concentration of sodium ions, the concentration of potassium ions. If these are normal, the excitability is normal. If there is an increase or decrease in the concentration of these agents, that is these ions, then the excitability gets altered. I'll come back to that particular point a little later. And then effect of external agents. Effect of external agents means the presence of normal body temperature or a hot environment or a cold environment, presence or absence of normal oxygen supply, whether you are having normal oxygen supply or there is a less oxygen saturation or hypoxia. All this will affect the excitability of the nerves. The other thing is a local response. Now, local response means that when a stimulus is given, the response normally should get transmitted from that particular point where the nerve is stimulated throughout the whole of the nerve. If the stimulus is little weak stimulus, the response may not get transmitted or may not get conducted all throughout the nerve, but may remain as a change there only. That is called as a local response, and this response is subjected to only that particular area of the body. Now, usually you have to understand the concept of a threshold stimulus. Now, what is threshold stimulus? Threshold stimulus is if the strength of the stimulus is adequate enough to generate an action potential, then you will find a impulse being generated. But if the stimulus is below the threshold level, where it is not reaching the minus 55 millivolts, then it will generate only a local response, or it will generate a graded response only. The example of which is a receptor potential or a synaptic potential. Now at synapses, what will happen is, whenever you know that synapse is a continuation of two nerve fibers, that junction is called as a synapse, or the junction where a neuron ends on a muscle, where you call it as a neuromuscular junction, is a type of a synapse. Now here, once the impulse reaches the synapse, even if it is a local threshold or below the threshold level, it is just sufficient enough to generate a change in the next nerve or in the muscle at neuromuscular junction. This potential which is generated in the muscle because of a subthreshold stimulus passing from the neuron to the muscle is called as a receptor potential or a synaptic potential. It will be not strong enough to travel through the entire length of the neuron, but it will be sufficient enough to generate a change in that particular nerve or in that particular muscle. So it is a local response, or it is also called as a receptor potential, or it is called a synaptic potential or a graded potential. We will learn in detail about this in the subsequent lessons of the neuromuscular junctions. Many of the neurons or many of the gland cells show these glandular changes, macrophages show this local response. For example, glandular changes. Now I will give you one example. When you are eating some food, when you take the food, the partially digested food, after passing from the oral cavity, goes into the stomach. In the stomach, the gastric mucosa, the neurons there come in contact with the food. The food particles stimulate certain cells to secrete more amount of hydrogen ions or secrete more amounts of enzymes. So what is this? The potential or the changes that partially digested food in the stomach stimulating the neurons of those cells in the stomach to generate the digestive enzymes, to release the digestive enzymes, is limited to that particular stomach area only, not that the whole of the GI tree starts secreting or start giving out its digestive enzymes. So that is the example of a graded response or a local response. Similarly, macrophages. What is macrophages? When do macrophages come into the picture? When the body gets an outside infection, the body responds by means of detecting these foreign substances or these foreign particles and causing the lymphocytes and the leukocytes to move to that particular area where the foreign bacteria has entered. This is another example of a local response or a graded response. The strength duration curve means that the response of the nerve depends upon the excitability and also on the duration to which this stimulus is applied. This is called as the strength duration curve. We will have a separate class on the strength duration curve. Now, excitability. As I said that one of the factor on which the excitability depends upon is the presence of external and internal agents. Now let us discuss the clinical implication of this, or how as a Indian medical graduate you are going to use these properties of nerve and action potential in day-to-day practice. We know that for the impulse to be generated, excitability has to happen, and this excitability is because of the development of an action potential. For the development of action potential, if you remember in the last class, I had told you that the sodium channels play an important role. So if the sodium ions are entering into the neuron, the action potential is generated. Coming on to a practical example here, suppose one injection is being given to you. When I give you an injection, or the one nurse administers an injection to you, you are getting pain at the site of injection. Why is there a pain at the site of injection? Because the needle which is being inserted into the muscle when an injection is being given stimulates the sensory nerve. This is a mechanical stimulus. The sensory nerves there are getting stimulated. By stimulated means what? There is some mechanical disturbance taking place. That injection which is entering into the muscle mass there is stimulating the nerve fiber. The nerve fiber, because of this change in the physical environment, is causing the sodium ions to open. When the sodium ions are opening, there is an influx of sodium ions which is causing an action potential. And since that nerve fiber is sensory in nature and the pain receptors are stimulated, you feel pain. Now, how do you block this pain? So, most of the surgical procedures we know that are painless. How they become painless? By giving anesthesia. Anesthesia, if you all might be knowing, is of two types. One is general anesthesia, the other is spinal, and the third is local anesthesia. Now, to take this example further, a local anesthesia means suppose you have got a cyst or a swelling, or you want that swelling to be removed or that cyst to be excised. So you will approach a surgeon. The surgeon will give you anesthesia there in the surrounding area. Once he gives a local anesthesia there, the anesthetist drug may be xylocaine or procaine. He injects that particular drug around that particular swelling. It anesthetizes it. So once that drug becomes effective, you do not feel pain, and the surgeon cuts it and removes the cyst and puts the suture back. All this becomes a painless procedure. Second example. Most of you would have seen that surgeries in the lower abdominal half or in the lower limbs are done under spinal anesthesia. What is spinal anesthesia? For example, a normal cesarean section. Cesareans are delivery of the baby by operative procedures. So it is a cesarean section, or if any procedure has to be done, like appendicectomy has to be done, or if some bladder surgery has to be done, they give spinal anesthesia. What is spinal anesthesia? Spinal anesthesia is nothing but they inject a needle into the lumbar space in that particular area, and they inject a drug xylocaine. Once the xylocaine drug is injected, your legs and the lower half of the abdomen becomes numb for around 30 to 40 minutes. Maybe some drugs may have the effect for 60 to 90 minutes. So totally you are pain free at that time, and this allows the surgeon to perform the surgery. Maybe an appendicectomy, or maybe a cesarean section, or maybe some lower limb surgery, or maybe some fixing up of some fracture or some lower limb orthopedic procedures. Now, in these both instances, I have given you an example of local anesthesia and general spinal anesthesia. How is that you are not able to feel the pain by injecting of that anesthetic drug? What does that drug do? In simple words, that drug blocks the sodium channels. When this drug goes on to is injected, it goes around the nerves and it sits on the receptors of the sodium channels, and it blocks the sodium channels. It does not allow the sodium channels to open. When the sodium channels are not getting open, even when you incise or you cut the skin in that particular area, the pain fibers are not getting stimulated, the sensory nerves are not getting stimulated, because the excitability is reduced because of the not opening up of the sodium channels. So this is how the local anesthetic like procaine and other xylocaine acts on the sodium channels, makes the sodium channels inactive, does not allow it to open, does not allow the action potential to be generated, and so you do not feel the pain, and this allows the surgeon to perform surgery. So this is the clinical importance or the relevant factor for the blocking of the sodium channels. So on one hand, we have learned how the sodium channels are responsible for the transmission of signals. Here it is the transmission of pain impulses, and how the injection of a local anesthetic drug helps us in relieving pain, and this in turn helps the surgeon to perform the surgical procedure. Conductivity, you just remember the things, it is all in detail, but for you it is necessary to understand that conductivity is the ability of the neuron or the nerve fiber to allow transmission of signals from one point to other point. Here what I mean is, when your nerve is getting stimulated, it is getting stimulated at one particular point only, but this change should not remain at that particular point, but it should travel throughout the length of the neuron, so that the transmission of impulses takes place within the neuron and from one neuron to the other neuron. So this is conductivity. Conductivity within the neuron is in both direction, but it can be normally it is in the one direction only, unidirectional from one neuron to other neuron. Transmission of impulses in the reverse direction does not take place. That is, from first order neuron it goes to second order to third order, but not the reverse way around from third to second and second to one. Secondly, the velocity of the conductivity or the velocity with which the impulses travel depends upon the myelination or non-myelination. This we shall discuss a little later. Now here the factors which are affecting conductivity is diameter. This diameter I think was told in the last class, where in Erlanger's and Gesiner classification the velocity of impulse or the conductivity depends upon the diameter of the nerve fiber. Fibers which are having more the thicker the size of the neuron, faster will be the velocity of conduction, or faster will be the conductivity. Now you go back after this class, open your textbooks and read the cause why in a thicker nerve fibers the velocity of conduction is more. What is that present within the thicker nerve fibers which help faster conduction than in a thinner nerve fibers? The other is myelination. Myelination means that whether the fiber is myelinated or not myelinated. In a non-myelinated fiber, the conduction or the velocity of conduction is slow. In a myelinated fibers, it is more. Temperature is till a little higher temperature, the velocity of conduction increases, but beyond which it is damaging to the neuron. So within physiological limits, the velocity of conduction increases with the increase in temperature. Whereas if the temperature is reduced, the conduction is slowed down. So this is taken in hypothermia. What is hypothermia? Hypothermia is putting the body under extreme low conditions. In extreme low conditions, the whole basal metabolic rate is slowed down. Because of the slowdown, because the activity is reduced, you also find that the low temperatures causes a decrease in the velocity of conduction. pH, chemicals, as I told you, there are certain chemicals and drugs, like for example, some poisons are there which will block the total conduction. Some chemicals may increase the conduction. In chemicals, I mean the ions, the sodium ions and the potassium ions. Mechanical pressures may increase. Say for example, conductivity may increase. Say for example, you are shaking hands with somebody. When you shake a hand with somebody, if somebody tries to squeeze your hand and tries to give a very warm handshake where he is pressing to the extent that your hand gets squeezed, you begin to feel the pain. So that is the pressure, increased mechanical pressure causing increased conductivity and more impulses being generated. Then the type of nerve, this is something related to the Erlanger's and Gesiner's classification. So the next property of the nerve is nerve action potential. I had told you this in the earlier class also. I will briefly revise this. Action potential is nothing but the change in the ions, where at resting condition the nerve is resting, and at resting condition there is an electronegativity inside, and that potential, at the potential which is present inside the nerve fiber when the nerve is under resting condition is called as the resting nerve potential or the resting membrane potential. And this potential is because of the presence of the sodium and the potassium ions. And I had also explained to you in the last class about that Goldman-Caxkin's equation, where when the membrane is permeable to both sodium and potassium ion, there is a different potential existing, and that is around minus 70 millivolts. You know that just if you go to the basics, the membrane, the neuron is surrounded by a membrane. The membrane is composed of a protein layer and a lipid layer. The resting membrane, the resting potential is the potential which is present in the nerve and at resting condition when it is not firing, and the resting membrane potential is minus 70 millivolts. Now what happens when there is a disturbance? So when there is a disturbance, the ions usually get exchanged or move across the membrane, resulting in the change in the potential, and that change in the potential is called as the action potential. Normally, if you see here, I'll just repeat it. Sodium ions more on the outside, potassium ions more on the inside, chloride ions more on the outside. There are organic anions inside. These are protein ions, and because of the abundance of the protein ions inside, there is a negative charge, and it is called and it gives a electronegativity inside. Now action potential is defined as the rapid changes in the membrane during which the membrane depolarizes and repolarizes. So what are the genesis of the action potential? How does these changes take place? I will just explain to you here. Now this is the nerve action potential. Here you will find that under resting membrane potential, under resting condition, the resting potential of a nerve is minus 70 millivolts. At this point of time, some stimulus is given. Maybe you imagine a pinprick has happened at particular nerve fiber. This nerve particular at this particular area becomes stimulated, and this stimulation causes the opening up of sodium ions. When there is an opening up of the sodium ions are moving from outside to inside. They are carrying positive charges because the sodium is moving from outside to inside, because there is a diffusion existing. Sodium ions are more on the outside than inside. So the sodium channels open because of this disturbance, and opening up of the sodium channels allow the sodium ions to move from outside to inside. So there is more positivity inside. Or in other words, there is less and less electronegativity building inside. Once there is less and less electronegativity building inside, the potential changes from minus 70 to minus 55 millivolts, and this takes a little slow, this takes a little time, and during this 0.2 or 0.3 milliseconds, the potential changes from minus 70 to minus 55, and this change in potential is called as generator potential. So at this point of time, when the minus 55 millivolts potential is reached, you will find that there is a sudden opening up of the sodium channels. Opening up of the sodium channels will cause sudden influx of sodium ions. Therefore, you will see that thousands of sodium channels open and sodium ions move from outside to inside. As a result of which, more positive ions coming inside the cell, the potential changes from minus 55 goes towards 0, and from 0 it goes to plus 35. It is called as an overshoot. This whole phase from minus 70 to 0 is called to plus 35 is called as the phase of depolarization. When the potential reaches plus 35 millivolts, you know that these are ionic or voltage gated sodium channels. Voltage gated sodium channels means the voltage is influencing their opening and closing. So when the potential reaches plus 35 millivolts, the potassium channels close. The sodium channels close. Once the sodium channels close, there is no more influx of sodium ions, but at the same time, at that particular point, the voltage gated potassium channels open at plus 35 millivolts. So the opening up of the potassium channels will allow potassium ions to go from inside to outside, because the concentration gradient is from inside to outside. So potassium is now moving from inside to outside. So now it is carrying positive charges outside. When it is carrying positive charges outside, so the potential starts falling from plus 35 and reaches the 0, and then further down to minus 55, and then to minus 70, and reaches the resting membrane potential. This phase is called as a depolarization phase. So at plus 35, the sodium channels close, the potassium channels open. At minus 70, when it reaches back, you will find that the potassium channels are also beginning to close. But a few channels remain open for some time. As a result, the potential falls little more below minus 70, and that is called as hyperpolarization. And this hyperpolarization is for a few milliseconds. Afterwards, these potassium channels also close, and the resting membrane potential is restored back to normal. So this is the genesis of the action potential, where the stimulus is given here, the potential changes here. This is the latent period. Then you have got a generator potential. It reaches a threshold potential, then the phase of depolarization, then the phase of repolarization, and then the phase of hyperpolarization, and back to resting membrane potential. So these are the mechanisms by which an action potential is generated. Same thing if you see in terms of channels. what are the changes taking place in the channels, in different channels during the different phases of action potential. So here if you see at minus 70 the sodium channels open. When it reaches here at minus 55, more and more sodium channels are opening, causing it to move from 0 to plus 30. By the time the potential moves up to plus 30, the sodium channels close, and at that point of time the potassium channels have opened. Now here more and more potassium channels are opening and the sodium channels are closing down. So because the potassium channels are open, they allow the movement of potassium ions from inside to outside, and the potential is now falling back because positive charges are going from inside to outside. So it restores back the potential down to electronegativity, and it reaches somewhere around minus 70. At this particular point, though it should have ended here, but it goes further down because see the time gap, the potassium channels are very slow to open and very slow to close, unlike the sodium channels which are very fast to open and close fast. So some of the potassium channels remain open for a long period of time, resulting in hyperpolarization, but ultimately they close. The potassium channels close here and the action potential comes to an end. Here this is the activation gate. So here this is the example depicting the sodium channel. The sodium channels are here. It has got an activation gate, it has got an inactivation gate. At resting membrane potential, the inactivation gate is open. Remember here the inactivation gate is open and the activation gate is closed. To give you the example here of local anesthetist which I explained to you earlier here, when you give the drug, this drug sits and binds on these receptors and prevents its opening. So when it doesn't opens at all, there is no opening up of the potassium sodium channels and no movement of sodium ions, so no action potential generated. So this is the status of the ion channel, sodium channel, that is the voltage gated sodium channel at minus 70 millivolts. The activation gate is closed and the inactivation gate is open. Let us see subsequently what happens. Subsequently, when the potential changes, you will find that the inactivation gate is already open, the activation gate also opens up. So here you will find that there is a conformational change as the potential is changing. It is a voltage gated channel, so as it reaches or a disturbance is happening, it is reaching minus 55 millivolts, a conformational change is happening, the activation gate also opens up. Here you will find that completely it is open. You will find that this is the activated gate and here it is open, but at plus 35 millivolts you will find that the inactivation gate closes up. So the inactivated gate is closed, but the activation gate remains open. In the next diagram, I think it is more clear here. Now see this. This is a resting membrane potential. This is the sodium channel. The activation gate is closed. The inactivation gate is open. Because there is activation gate is closed, sodium is not moving from outside to inside. Now as you give a stimulus and the membrane potential changes from minus 90 to let's say minus 70, a sudden conformational change takes place and this causes the activation gate to open. So the activation gate is open, the inactivation gate is already open, so both the gates are open and it allows sodium to move from outside to inside. Now let us see when it reaches plus 35. So from plus 35 to minus 90 millivolts, what is the status here? Here what will happen is the inactivation gates close. So once the inactivation gates close at plus 35, you will find that no more entry of sodium ions is taking place. But here there is a difference. Here, while opening, it was the activation gate which is opened up and allowing sodium ions to come back to normal. But whereas while stopping at plus 35, the inactivation gets closed. So how does this get reversed? Now this gets reversed when the resting membrane potential reaches back to minus 90. Again a conformational change takes place and at minus 90 only this gets restored back to the initial stage. So now between minus 90 and the next stimulus, this conformational change takes place. So that is how the sodium channels are restored back to normal. What is the importance of this change taking place? I will tell you in the last slide. Now here it is the potassium channels. You will see the potassium channels at minus 90 millivolts. You will find the potassium channels are closed. They remain closed till plus 35. When the plus 35 millivolts is reached, you will find that the gates open up and allow the potassium ions to move from inside to outside. So there is an efflux of potassium ions. So remember here what is happening at plus 35 millivolts. There are two channels. The inactivation gate of the sodium is closed, whereas the gate of the potassium is open. So sodium influx stops, potassium efflux begins. This is the diagram here where it is showing how is the extracellular potassium and the sodium which is taking place in the intracellularly. This is the sodium ions which is moving up, and this is the opening up of the activation rate. It is wrongly given as potassium. In fact, it is the sodium ions which is there. Now, how does the resting potential comes back to normal? Once it restores normal, as I said, I told you in the last class, read how this concentration of sodium ions and potassium ions restored back to normal. So at the end of the action potential, the concentrations are restored back to normal because of the sodium potassium pumps. So whatever extra sodium ions have come inside and whatever extra potassium ions have gone outside, during the depolarization and repolarization, they are restored back to normal by the sodium potassium ATPase pump, where 3 sodium and 2 potassium move across in the opposite directions. Now the other property is the refractory period. What do you mean by refractory period? Refractory period is the period when the nerve doesn't respond. There are two types of refractory period: absolute refractory period and relative refractory period. Absolute refractory period is the period where you will find that there is whatever the stimulus you give, whatever the strength of the stimulus you give, there will be no impulse generated. That means you have already given one stimulus. After that, you give a second stimulus of any higher strength, the nerve will not respond. That phase is called as the absolute refractory period, and that phase lasts till the 1/3 of repolarization. From this here threshold potential, the whole of depolarization and 1/3 of repolarization comes under absolute refractory period. Relative refractory period is the period from the remaining 2/3 of the repolarization phase, where a more than normal stimulus or more than a threshold stimulus or a supra-threshold stimulus may generate a response, and that is called as the relative refractory period. Now let us see physiologically what is the importance here. During absolute refractory period, no second impulse will generate an action potential because the sodium channels are totally closed. If you remember the earlier slide which I had showed you, I had told you here that this is the state at the repolarization phase where the inactivation gate is closed, the activation gate is open. For the inactivation gate to open, the resting membrane potential has to come back to -90 millivolts, otherwise this will never open. So only at -90 millivolts the conformational change takes place again, the inactivation gates open and the activation gates close. So hence you will find that in absolute refractory period, whatever may be the strength of the stimulus, there is a period of no response or unresponsiveness. In relative refractory period, you may get a response because some of the sodium channels can open with a stronger strength of stimulus. So those channels which are having a little higher threshold, some sodium channels may have a little higher threshold for opening, or those sodium channels which have not opened in the previous stimulus, with a normal or a supranormal or supra-threshold stimulus, they may open. So some response can be seen in relative refractory period. So here you will find in absolute refractory period, this is the conductance of sodium ions. You will find that the conduction of sodium ions is further down. Relative refractory period, the conduction of sodium potassium is still further down because the sodium channels are inactivated. Now what is accommodation? Now accommodation means if the membrane is depolarized slowly, action potential will never be generated. Now what do you mean by if the membrane is depolarized slowly? Slowly it means that a slowly rising action potential will not generate an action potential. Now I think it's time 11:05. We will continue this in the next class because the next session is waiting for you all. Thank you all of you. The remaining properties we shall continue in the next class. Just go through the timetable which we have uploaded and at least come prepared for the next class at least. Thank you.